Well, again, the only way I know how to answer that is, again, from a scriptural perspective. What did God do in Israel? Right? And in Israel, charity was not done. First of all, charity was not coerced. All right? The second thing that means then is it wasn't taken care of through the state, through the civil government. It was actually administered by the religious leaders, by the Levites. And so in Israel, the way it worked was people brought their tithes. In those days, right, it wasn't a credit card. It was they brought their animals, they brought a tenth of their crops, whatever, right, to store cities where these things would be stored, and then those things could be administered to those who needed it, whenever they needed it. And so it was administered through the church. And if you look back in history, that was true by and large up until the 20th century in the United States. So charity was oftentimes managed either through voluntary associations before the 1930s, or it was managed through the church. And the thing about that is it meant more freedom. Right? Because the government wasn't coercing people. And so we actually had more liberty as a result of that. And there were constraints. I mean, one of the things that we see today is that there are no constraints on what the civil government can promise. See, in Israel, it was self-controlled. And what I mean by that is because what they brought with their tithes, and they didn't bring a credit card, right? What they brought with their tithes were real physical things. They could never give out more to the poor than what they had. Right? They could never borrow from the future to take care of the present. And so it constrained them in terms of how they gave. And going back to something we talked about earlier, people, because it was voluntary, the tithe itself was voluntary, bad people would not give their tithe, right? But God held them accountable as a people. And so one of the things they should have done as a society is really inculcate in the young that they have this responsibility to give. And therefore, then they would have not been judged by God for failing to give. All right? And certainly the poor are harmed when people don't give what they ought to give. Right? But God, in his wisdom, never said, well, the solution to the bad people who won't give is to send the government there with a gun to take it away from them. Because at the end of the day, charity can only be voluntary. Otherwise, what's happening is I'm being charitable with your money. Right? So, in charity is an individual thing, and it's something that we're held accountable to by God, but government's never given the authority to hold us accountable for charity. Well, first of all, that probably leads into the other topic, which is the family, right? And so the family is where the education of children is expected to take place. And again, we have to remember things were different. There are similarities and things are different. So in ancient Israel, Israel was an agrarian economy. And so what would happen there is Junior would grow up on the farm, if I can use that term, and he would learn to be a farmer or a sheep herder or whatever the family was. Today, our society is much more complicated. And so vocational training, in other words, how we're going to earn a living, we delegate that to other people. And we just have a much wider range of things we can choose to do. If I don't want to be a farmer, if Dad's a farmer and I don't want to be a farmer, I don't have to be a farmer. Mm-hmm. But Dad has the responsibility to make sure that I have the opportunity to learn what it is I want to do. Now, there is one example in Scripture of the state doing educating. And the example has to do, I can't remember now for sure which king it is. It might be Jehoshaphat. I'd have to go back and do some recovery of that memory. But the state supports the education of people as to what the law is. And so it would have a legitimate responsibility to teach us what the laws require. Okay? It's not a vocational teaching. It's more of a legal teaching, right? What are the laws that we're expected to obey? And so it can have that kind of a responsibility to make sure that we know what the state is going to hold us accountable for, right? But not a vocational training, not what I'll call a general educational training, learning how to read, write, do basic arithmetic, those kinds of things. That's all part of the family's responsibility to prepare their children to be adults. It used to kind of be that way because public schools were controlled locally. That's not true anymore. Public schools are controlled by the state and by the federal government. And so it's not a local decision anymore where a bunch of families got together and say, we're all going to contribute. Right, because so much of their funding comes from elsewhere, right? And so in the Bible, there was never an expectation that my neighbor had a responsibility to help me educate my children. And so it was a family responsibility. But this whole idea of public education has morphed into this idea of what I'm going to call indoctrination. And there's a couple of views. One is people will argue, well, what about the family that doesn't care enough about their children to actually educate them, right? And then the other one is the fear of, or the argument that gets made is, well, they're just going to educate their children to believe X, Y, Z, and we don't believe X, Y, Z, so that's harmful to society at large. But at the end of the day, that's a loss of liberty. And so we have the responsibility to educate our children, and it's not the responsibility of the state. And it didn't used to be. In America, it was not the responsibility of the state until the 1830s and 40s. And in fact, one of the major motivators for doing that was because since education up to that point was left up to the families and to the churches, and it was very much more religious than it is today, the actual purpose of it was to reduce the amount of religious education that was going on. And so the biblical model would be that the church has a responsibility, if you will, to educate the parents. And the parents have the responsibility to educate the children. Now, again, the parent can delegate that. But when that parent stands before God, God is the one that, God is going to hold them accountable, right, for what they delegated. Just like God will hold the civil government accountable for how it's used its authority, and God will hold elders in the church accountable for how they exercise their authority as well.